This is 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. This edition of the program is dedicated to the life and the work, the fabulous scholarship, as well as personality of the late Professor Brinsley Samaru. In an article, in a letter to the editor, as a matter of fact, carried in the Express on July 12th, a couple of days after it was reported that Professor Samaru had died, Vishnu Bisram, a New York-based Guyanese-born political analyst and pollster, said a number of things. He says the region has lost an outstanding academic. He said he had worked way back in the late 1970s with Professor Samaru when they did work on trying to understand the situation in the Caribbean about the Indo-Guyanese and Indo-Trinidadian and elsewhere where people came from India to live in the Caribbean, and they worked on that and a number of issues. And he says, my last encounters with Samaru were at several state functions held in Suriname for visiting Indian President Drupadi Murmu in early June. Dr. Samaru was the chief guest at a function on slavery and indentureship at the University of Suriname to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the first arrival of Indians in Suriname. These things and more as part of the discussion with Mr. Bisram. Good to have you, my friend.
Thank you very much for having me to pay tribute to this outstanding, iconic personality, a really great historian, professor, academic at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine campus.
All right, I want to quote some of what you said that's carried in this piece in the Express, but before that, side by side with your letter to the editor, there's one from Professor Emeritus Ramesh Diosaran, and the headline on that was that Brinsley taught and made history. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, most certainly he taught history. I mean, that was his main subject that he studied in India, and he studied classical Indian history as well as contemporary Indian history when he was a student there. And then he went on to England where he did his PhD. So certainly he taught history at the University of the West Indies, and he made history in the sense that the kind of subjects he taught, the kind of students he had, at the campus, and also the lectures he delivered not only in Trinidad, but in Guyana, in Suriname, and in the United States. He was a frequent visitor to India as well. I met him teaching at lecturing at Jawaharlal Nehru University some years ago when he was a guest of the Indian government to discuss issues relating to the Indian diaspora.
Yeah, you see, we met in Trinidad and Guyana, in the U.S., in India, and Suriname.
On the Indian diaspora.
Yeah. You all met on different occasions for the same reasons. You see, for instance, we met in Trinidad and Guyana, in the U.S., in India, in Suriname. Like myself, Ravi Dev, Professor Mauritius Hassan Khan, he was a guest of the Indian government in 2016 to discuss challenges facing Indo-Caribbean people.
Right. Now, we must not take away from the fact that he not only taught Indian history, he also taught history of the Caribbean. He also taught and focused a bit on politics as well, because he himself was a politician. We shouldn't forget that he was affiliated with the ULF, Basdeo Pandey, around 1979, 1980, and he became an opposition senator in 81, and I believe he was leader of the opposition from 82 to 86. And he assisted in the formation of the National Alliance for Reconstruction, ANR, when A.N.R. Robinson became the leader of the movement and ultimately was elected prime minister.
Yeah. One of the things that, speaking for myself, one of the things that stands out for me with him and a relationship with him over these decades is that during that time that he was Minister of Agriculture. He was MP for Nariva at the time. He was one of those MPs and ministers and politicians who had no problem with talking with pesky reporters like myself. He was always a tease. He didn't dodge. He didn't have any sense of, foreboding or trying to escape discussing things with me, at least. And it's something that I stayed with about him, and I will remember that all the time. It seems as though he was always publishing a book. Just a couple of days before he died, either a book or part of history, there was this piece in the Express in which the reporter Richard Charan had got some information about how and we didn't know that in the country. A lot of what happened with the riots that led to what is called the Butler riots. And there were things happening before that in different parts of the country. People tend to focus on what happened in Faizabad, but I read stuff by him which was saying that in many parts of the country, otherwise, people were demonstrating and people were showing their opposition to what was happening at the time. And so he was continuing to bring out stuff that in some cases we took for granted, and in other cases we didn't know up to now.
That's quite true. You know, he was very unique. Every time I went to Trinidad and I visited UE, he was always in the library. For whatever reason, he was doing some kind of research, unearthing something, some aspects of Trinidad history. And you're right, he did bring out a lot of things that we were not aware of. I know for a fact that he completed 2 manuscripts. One of it is on the press right now. And the other one, I think he was finishing up or had just finished, that will go to the press. I am told by his friends that both are completed and they will be published soon. But yes, I agree with you that he writes and focuses things that other historians, other academics failed to do research on.
Yeah, and he was comfortable in his skin. He never had airs about anything. He was humble.
That's absolutely right. And you know, he was very, very articulate. He never evaded the press. We must not forget, in the first year of the NAR administration, I think he was in charge of the media, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and that's your point. He didn't evade, and he wasn't evasive at all. He didn't hide. He wasn't circumspect, as a lot of people would be suspecting that reporters were out to catch them and so on. He was comfortable all the time talking with people.
He was a very genuine, down-to-earth person. He was like a real serious politician, out to do serious work. He was not into enriching himself. He did a lot of good things to people. I remember whenever we had conferences, he would sponsor a lot of events and activities at his, I don't know if it was his own guest house in Mayaro.
Yes, it was his.
And so many of us would go to his place as his guest. So he really gelled with everyone, and ethnicity didn't matter to him. You know, his students were of all ethnicities from all of the islands throughout the region. He was well adored in Guyana and Suriname, where he commanded great respect, and where he delivered feature addresses and keynote speeches at the 1-week conference on slavery and indentureship.
Yeah, you say your last encounters with him were at several state functions in Suriname for the visiting Indian president. When was that?
Okay, so that was the first week of June. Indian arrival day was June 5th, the national holiday in Suriname. And I think we were there from June 2nd. We traveled together from Trinidad to Suriname. So we had discussions at the airport, on the aircraft. And down when we arrived in Suriname, we all were in one bus. And we talked about contemporary politics in Trinidad as well. So politics was in his vein, even though he was a historian.
Yeah, and you also say that we had a long relationship going back to the late 1970s when a group of us, and you called names there, met in New York, involved in the struggle for democracy in Guyana. And you communicated with him to support the similar movement launched by our friend in Trinidad.
In those days, it was very costly for us as students to use the phone. So we communicated by mail, and he responded to us, and then he visited, we visited Trinidad for the 1981 elections, and we offered him a helping hand, the party that is. And he came up in New York, and we had several engagements and encounters. When he became a minister, we also supported the NAR at that particular time in '86. And right after the election, I think it was some early part of '87, he came to New York and asked us to host the Fourth Conference of Indians in the Caribbean. And we renamed the conference at the time the Fourth Conference of Indians in the Diaspora, because we wanted to focus globally, not just on the Caribbean. He was very supportive at that time. Unfortunately, the NAR government did not offer us much financial assistance for the conference.
All right, and one of the papers this morning, again, Harry Partap, who is a former journalist and former politician in UNC government, describes him as being gracious and accommodating.
Yes. Right, I missed that. What you were saying?
Yeah. The headline on Harry Partap's letter to the editor in the paper this morning describes Professor Samaru as gracious and accommodating.
Oh, yes, yes, no doubt about it. Absolutely no doubt. And look, you know what? He was willing to serve administrations regardless of which political party was in office. I mean, he was ULF, and then he became NAR, then he became UNC, then he became Partnership. And recently he was willing to give a helping hand even to the PNM administration, where he had expertise, which was in history and in building a museum. He was put in charge at one particular time to build a museum on sugarcane, and I don't know what became of it. Funding was cut off or something, and that particular project died. But yes, I agree with Harry Partap that he was very, very accommodating to everyone. And he was also very helpful for those of us who wanted to do research. I can't think of anyone who went to Trinidad and didn't consult Brinsley Samaru. I know a lot of students at Delhi University, JNU, Banaras University, who came to Trinidad specifically to meet Brinsley Samaru, and he was very, very helpful in the research on the Caribbean, whether it was in history or political development.
Yeah, and one of his fellow professors, Professor Jerome Tilak Singh, described him as a humble servant of knowledge.
Absolutely. Very, very humble, down to earth, yes.
All right, my friend, thank you very much for talking with us on this. Vishnu Bisram.
Thank you, sir, for having me
Good
to share these memories of Brinsley Samaru.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, bye.
All right.
People really want to know, what about me? Where do I fit? Yes. What is in the ride for me in terms of a better Trinidad and Tobago? And I'm pleased to shed some light on that.
The purpose of bail is to ensure your attendance at court. That's it. It is not punitive, it is not rehabilitative.
We, the police officers, we are professional, and we are here for whenever the survivor is ready to come forward.
We have the right to private and family life, the right to religious freedoms and beliefs and thoughts and expression. But these rights are not absolute. Certain rights can be limited.
The law is to govern the whole, it's for all of us in public.
Welcome back to our program, this special edition of 10 Questions. We're looking at the life and times of the inimitable Dr. Brinsley Samaru. Our guests now, Professor Emeritus in History, Professor Bridget Brereton, and Professor Ken Ramchan. We'll get to them in a moment. Let me just read what is written in the opening paragraphs of a piece in the Express on Wednesday, July 12th, about Professor Samaru's passing. On the night before Professor Samaru fell ill, he had a book on his mind. His manuscript on the history of San Fernando was nearing completion, but he was trying to fit in a final character, said his wife Joan. Then he retired to bed, went to hospital the next morning, and we lost him 7 days later. No one who knew Samaru would be surprised by this. It was his character, his work ethic was legendary, his self-sacrifice without equal. At 83 years old, he had 3 writing projects in the works, and these books will be published in his memory and honor by his friend Clifford Narayan Singh. Professor Brereton, let's come to you. I'm trying to get a sense from the Brinsley Samaru you knew. Tell us a little bit about that. You said that there's nothing new that you could say about him that you haven't said already.
Well, I knew Brinsley not as long as Ken Ramchan, but long enough. We first met 1968, 69, when he came home with his newly minted PhD from London. He came back to take up a lectureship at the Department of History at St. Augustine, and I had just started my doctoral research also at St. Augustine, and we have been close friends and colleagues ever since. As everybody who knew Brinsley, and that's thousands of people, would acknowledge, he was a tremendously sociable, genial, affable, kind person. There is absolutely nobody who asked Brinsley for help, any kind of help, who didn't get his attention and his assistance. Actually, I often thought that Brinsley was insanely generous with his time. He said no to nobody. He helped everybody with knowledge, advice. He introduced the person to all kinds of relevant individuals. He drove them all over the place, that kind of thing. He was a beloved teacher. He had tremendous class presence. His lectures were certainly not dry, and he engaged his students. Students loved him, as you can gather from the outpouring of grief of people who might just have done one undergraduate course with him. So that was the kind of personality he was.
Yeah, like you said, he never probably said no to anybody. And I could tell you as a reporter over some of these years and that time, particularly when he was in government, he was one of the few who didn't have any reservations about talking to people like me. He didn't have any, and from what I've seen otherwise with him, he didn't walk around with chips on his shoulder. He operated as ordinarily as anybody could.
Yes, I think that's true. And his personal lifestyle was one of simplicity. He didn't have airs or graces. He didn't put on any affectations. His lifestyle was simple. It didn't change much, whether he was in academia, in government, or in retirement. It didn't change much. He did have a great work ethic. He was always researching, writing, reading, scribbling, talking. He was always enthused about his latest project, whether it was a book project, an article he was writing, whether it was the ill-fated Sugar Museum at Sevilla House, whether it was very, very recently the new plaque in Rio Claro, his hometown, to commemorate 5 people who were killed during the labor protests of June, July 1937. He was always enthusiastic. He had an almost boyish, almost childlike enthusiasm for research and for his work.
Yeah, and that, again, Richard Sharon wrote about a couple of weeks ago. He was the only one who, thus far, I've seen, whose stories and who tells the history of those moments wider than the idea that, well, certainly I grew up with it, everything centered in Faizabad, but there were other things that he wrote, that there were things happening in different parts of the country in the same kind of a way, that time in June 1937.
That's right, that's correct. Let's not forget that he was a very accomplished academic historian, very well qualified. He knew how to do proper academic research. He wrote important books. I would single out the biography of Adrian Cola Rienzi.
Yes.
Now, those of us around Brinsley had been waiting for that book for a long time, I have to tell you. He had been working on it for many, many years, so we were delighted when it did finally come out. It's an important book-length study of a man who really was one of the makers of modern Trinidad in the period between about 1935 and 1944. So I would single that out, but as you know, he had other books. One rather curious, unusual book was a short biography of Howard Nankivell.
Yeah.
Not many people have heard of him. He was a British colonial civil servant, a senior colonial civil servant, who happened to be acting colonial secretary and then labor secretary in 1937. And he risked his career by publicly stating that he thought that Butler and Butler's comrades had good reason for their protest, that the oil industry and the sugar industry had behaved very unfairly in an exploitative way to their workers. That cost him his career.
Yeah.
In fact, you can say it cost him his life.
Well, yeah, because the book is entitled The Price of Conscience, and I saw it in a bookstore in London some years ago, and I saw that it was written by Professor Samaru, and I picked it up and I read it, and I was stunned because growing up as a boy, I knew there was this calypso called Mr. Nankivell's speech, and I never knew what it was about for all these decades until reading the book then. And he suggested that the man he was sent to Cyprus, and from reading the book, my sense is that the man jumped off a train one day because he was so
he was
depressed.
obviously profoundly depressed. It was almost certainly suicide. So he lost his job, and one could say indirectly he lost his life. It was characteristic of Brinsley, I would say, that he picked up that story. Although his general politics, you could say, were nationalistic and anti-colonial, he was a very fair-minded person. And so he had no problem. He was invited to do this research by Mr. Nankivell's son, Edward Nankivell, who is still alive, an elderly gentleman.
Wow.
And Mr. Nankivell Jr. gave Brinsley a lot of family documents and photographs, and Brinsley took it up, and the result was that short but intriguing biography.
Yeah, all right. Let me bring you into the discussion, Professor Ramchand. Let's talk a little bit about the Brinsley Samaru you knew.
Well, I knew the Brinsley Samaru of the period 1953 to 2023. So I've known him for over 70 years. And in many ways, our lives and careers didn't intersect as such, but they ran parallel with very frequent crossovers where we would work on something together. And we started off at Naparima College, sharing in the life of the dormitory. It is there that we learned that you could eat bread and karaili and bread and red beans. The staler the bread, the better. We had a lot of bad food in the dormitory together. We had very long cramming sessions. The dean in the dormitory used to say you have to switch off your lights at 10. But we used to get these huge boxes and hang an electric bulb into the cardboard box and go inside there and read for as long as we wanted. So we broke certain rules in the dormitory and had, great fraternity. He had a superb gift of imitating the way people walked and talked. And he appreciated them as persons, but he also found in all of us our little absurdities and foibles and turns of speeches that weren't quite elegant. So he a great imitator and actor type. He took part in the drama. He wasn't a great volleyball player, but he was on the court at all times, and we used to go down also to Paradise Pasture, which is at the foot of Naparima College. The most, it had as many holes as a Trinidad road with potholes. So when you were playing football there, you ran the risk of breaking your ankle. Brinsley was there with all of us playing football. So there was a kind of closeness and camaraderie in the early period. He never got vexed about anything. We had these oration contests, which I'm afraid I always came in first and he came in second. He never got vexed. We never got jealous of one another. But every year I would sit down and say, oh God, I wonder if Brinsley will take it this year. And he probably was sitting down and saying the same thing. And we chatted and we met James Lewa and we met the theater people. He even acted in a play and he invented comic sketches, which we put on in the dormitory and so on. So he was a very fun-loving, ebullient person, and he was affectionate. We were very serious too, and in the dormitory, our first real cooperation began. We started up a newspaper written in my handwriting. They wouldn't read it if it was his. Written in my handwriting on a double foolscap page, and we used to stick that up. And all the boys in the dormitory would come and read it and give us jokes for next time and give us episodes for next time. So we kept that newspaper going for about a year. I wish I could find even one copy now, but I can't. But then we graduated into a radio station, which we called the Blue Circle Network. The school had rediffusion boxes in all the classrooms, and every morning, Reverend Lute would come and read us the Christian message and give us a mini sermon and tell us news about the school. So we asked him whether we could get a 5 to 10 minute spot right after that for the Blue Circle Network. And there was no demur, no protest, no conditions laid down. Sure, he said. And we started the Blue Circle Network, which ran for several years and which, as I've written elsewhere, we were the ones who discovered Trevor McDonald, because in those days, Trev spoke more English than English people. Already, he was doing that. And we had this very witty fellow called Franklin Bobby Thomas, who became a pilot.
And they were friends.
And we introduced those guys into broadcasting. So the Blue Circle Network, and we were very modern, right? Here we were in the 1950s running a radio station in the school. So we were very, very close in that period. And, you know, it was all the things that Bridget says, you know, affable, generous, sympathetic, willing to take part in anything. Even from those days, he's the most punctual man I have ever met.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you just to hold your point. Let's just get back in, Professor Britton, a little bit before we close it out. If Professor Britton, what would you like to see happen in terms of how he will be remembered, how he should be remembered as this kind of a prolific writer, academic, historian, continuing to chronicle different aspects of the history of Trinidad and Tobago until actually his last day?
Yes, all of that. He combined the best of two traditions, academic history writing. Ken and I are both academics, so we don't knock academics. You have got to do the research professionally. You have to write it up professionally. So he combined that tradition with the tradition of the public intellectual and the public historian. And that's the historian who sees it as his or her business to get out to the public the findings, whether through articles in the newspaper, which I have tried to do and Ken has tried to do, or Brinsley spoke. I have no idea how many public talks and lectures Brinsley gave all over the country, how many tours to historical places Brinsley led, how many initiatives for the public dissemination of accurate knowledge about our history he began or followed up. I mentioned the Sugar Museum. He rescued single-handedly the archives of Caroni Limited when it was closed down by the government. Those archives are now in the National Archives and over time will be preserved and processed, etc., etc. So he combined those two important traditions. He was a chronicler of his country's history, particularly the 20th century, which was his area of specialization. The book you mentioned when you read from the article in the Express is his history of San Fernando in the 20th century. It's the sequel to the very long earlier book by Michael Anthony called Anaparima, which took the history of San Fernando in the 19th century. Thankfully, the San Fernando book by Brinsley has been finished. I have actually seen a printout of the manuscript on the famous table in the UE Library, which Brinsley occupied, practically lived at for the last many years. So that, I have no doubt, will be published. So yes, he's going to be remembered for all those things, and also for inspiring a lot of students. He was an engaging and inspiring undergraduate teacher, and he advised and supervised graduate students, both here at UWI and at UTT, where, you know, he spent a time as a senior research fellow. So all of those things he'll be remembered. And for a patriot, Brinsley was a patriot. His government service, I think, came out of patriotism. He went into it, and he left it. And he came back to academia. In a humble sort of way, he reapplied for a position. I know this because I was head of the history department at the time. When he decided he was quitting politics in 1991, he did not assume the history department would quietly bring him back in. A vacancy had to occur, and he reapplied. He applied for it and re-entered the Department of History. So Brinsley Samaru was a patriot of the old school.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Bridget Brighton. We're going to thank you from the deepest in our hearts about it. Many people in the country feel the same way as you will do. We're going to go out with some closing remarks from Professor Ramchan.
Yes. Yeah, Andy, I want to go back to the Sugar Museum. And the story behind that is interesting. I'll try to be swift. When we were at the UTT, we heard that there was a madman whose name, thankfully, I don't remember, was getting rid of all the documents that had been accumulating there over the years, telling you about what sickness the Indians had, who were the doctors, what were the salaries and the troubles and so on. And I went to Professor Julian and told him about it and took Professor Samaru with me. And we went there, and Professor Julian agreed right away that we should try and rescue those documents. Some of them I took over to the Academy for Arts, Letters, and Public Affairs. But eventually, university money came, and we got the thing carted away. And Brinsley brought his graduate students and his undergraduates to help to go through and clean up and sort those documents. I'm saying all of this because at a certain point, when we decided there should be a sugar museum, it was as if this fellow's dream was coming true. Immediately, he took over the whole thing, and he designed the sugar museum, and he collected pieces for the sugar museum and wrote up plans for the sugar museum. He's sugar museum soul. And in one or two pieces, I have been pleading that the greatest memorial we can do to him is to resuscitate the Sugar Museum, which was a place that people were already visiting when he was unceremoniously kicked off from leading it, and it has just fallen apart. So I think that the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago should reconsider its attitude toward the Sugar Museum and even the Petroleum Museum, which we can revive and leave as a lasting monument to Brinsley Samaru, calling it the Brinsley Samaru National Sugar Museum. I think what he did there encapsulates almost everything else that he did.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Ken Ramchan. Well, that will do it for us in this edition of the program. This has been a special edition of 10 Questions, looking back at the life and times of the inimitable, irreplaceable Professor Brinsley Samaru. Our thanks to Professor Ken Ramchan, to Professor Bridget Brighton, and to Mr. Vishnu Bishram, who we spoke with in the first part of this program. I'm Andy Johnson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Young at heart, purpose-driven, patriot even. When you like to party, but are still passionate about discussing important issues, The only place where your needs will be met is WESN, Content Capital.
I'm Keaton Shaw, and we are WESN, the Content Capital.
Knowing how to tell authentic is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Find it, match it, search it. Step 1. Find the style number on the tag. Step 2. Match the style number inside the jersey with the number on the tag. Step 3. Search it. A quick Google search of the style number will verify the jersey is authentic when the search results match the jersey being searched. Don't be fooled by counterfeit jerseys. Before you buy, remember to find it, match it, search it.
Fan Zone, 2 locations nationwide. Center City Mall, Chaguanas, and Movietown, Port of Spain. Nationwide delivery available.
Join me, Sule A. Joseph, as I delve into the day-to-day psychological issues plaguing our society. We will discuss behaviors that encompass the biological influences, social pressures, and environmental factors that affect how you think, act, and feel. Sight, Thursdays at 11:30 a.m., only on WESN, Content Capital.
Is it politics? What is it? Is it that nobody cares about sports?
The kind of support that sport used to get in the past is no longer here.
The thing is, taking a knee doesn't mean that that's the only thing you're doing on it.
Right.
Taking a knee along with other stuff.
Samantha, what are you looking forward to when you return home to Trinidad and Tobago after winning the title?
Thank you very much for speaking it into existence.
Is there no pressure on Nicholas Ball?
It makes me more motivated to work hard and to go out there and rep the red, white, and black.
Why are we sending a team to the Winter Olympics?
There are a number of Trinbagonians who are in the diaspora and have grown up in winter sport. It's an opportunity that the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee will not close the door.
I also believe in the players that we have. Once you can motivate the players, you can get the best out of them.
We are WESN, the premier platform for Caribbean content. WESN, covering West, East, South, and North. WESN, we entertainment, sports, and news. WESN, available on Greendot 7, Amplia 118, Airlink 17, Bmobile.